Good afternoon and welcome to today's session on planning and measuring impact and outcomes of technology investments with our expert Vikas Mujumdar. Vikas is a career technologist, having spent the last 3 decades in various roles with the last few years as the CIO at Aditya Birla Payments Bank and Equifax. Vikas also spent some time working as head of digital transformation and innovation for the Aditya Birla Group, advising their old economy businesses on their transformation strategy and execution. Vikas has recently set up an edtech and consulting venture, STEMventure.com. The focus is on delivering learning programs on computing technology of the future, including cloud computing, AL/ML, blockchain, 3D printing, AR/VR, and drones. The programs cater to both students and professionals with a focus on hands-on learning for students and industry application orientation for professionals. Welcome, Vikas.
Thank you, Neeta, for the kind introduction. And thank you everyone for joining. Let's hope we can make this a very useful session for all. So let's just dive right in. This is actually part 2 of a 3-part series that we're doing. In the first part, we covered the digital transformation technology landscape. Basically, in that, we talked about what are the available technologies and what would be the right approach for any business to decide on adoption. It's not like every technology is relevant to every business, and it costs money to invest in those technologies. So it's the best approach is to see what is relevant for you and what will give you the most return on your investment. So that's what we talked about in the first session. Now, in today's session, which is a follow-up to the first session, we will actually cover a little bit about measuring the value that technology brings to business, right? It's great to say that we need to invest. It's great to say that we need to get into digital transformation. But are we really understanding what value this technology brings to business? Now, there are multiple reasons why we need to understand that. As technologists, as the CIOs in the company, there are multiple reasons why you need to be aware of this. One is for your own internal management, right? How do you manage your own IT operations and manage them efficiently? That's one reason. But there's a second and equally important reason where you need to be able to convince business and convince your management and leadership team that IT is adding value. IT is not just a support function. IT actually adds value to business growth. And especially if you look at the new way technology is being adopted, especially with digital transformation and all of the new things that technology can do, I think technology can help take business to the next level. So we are no more a support function. Now, how do you demonstrate that? One is, very subjective anecdotal evidences. But what is more important is to be able to measure and actually demonstrate the value of technology to a business using metrics. All right. So that's what session 2 is all about. And with that introduction, let me just dive right in. To explain very briefly, I've spent about 3 decades now in doing IT for various kinds of businesses, both from digital first solutions to old economy solutions that were getting introduced to technology and so on. So I've had a chance to see adoption of technology in a very wide range of fields. And I know what comes with it. Each business has its own challenge. Each business needs its own approach, right? So let me just set the context. What is the purpose of metrics? Everybody talks about metrics and KPIs, and everybody does some sort of measurement of metrics. I don't think there's denying that. But do we all really understand what exactly these metrics mean and how they can be leveraged to improve performance and improve business? I'm going out on a limb, but I would tend to say that often metrics are used only as a manner of presentation, right? Just to demonstrate whether it's a weekly or a quarterly board review, etc. Quite often metrics are simply a basis for presenting. But actually they come with a lot more value where you can dig deeper and figure out how to change the way you run technology, right? So let me explain a little bit. So first of all, technology drives almost every aspect of business today. I think that's a given now. And businesses understand that they must invest in technology. But the value that businesses are getting from this investment, I'm not sure that's clearly understood, right? And I feel from my personal experience as well that quite the contrary, technology is required everywhere. I mean, you can do almost nothing without technology today. But at the same time, when anything goes wrong with any aspect of the business, the first area that is hauled up is technology, right? And that's because that's core to every function that we do. So I think it's important that technology teams are able to demonstrate what they're doing right, and of course what they're doing wrong as well, right? It's not only about saying everything is going well. And that's the subject, that's the what we will dig deeper into in this session, right? So essentially metrics, and the key word there in the next sentence are measures of quantitative assessment, right? And that's very important because qualitative assessment is no good. I mean, you cannot just subjectively say this application is running slow. Is it really running slow for the volume it is processing, for the purpose it is intended? That kind of quantitative assessment is required. It cannot just be a human feeling that things are not working well, right? Or the other way around, it cannot be a human feeling that everything is fine. So metrics are important because they're a quantitative assessment and they can tell you exactly what is going wrong, how and where, right? So, and if you look at the purpose, capturing and analyzing metrics can not only help improve performance, but it can improve transparency with the functions outside of technology and enable an objective data-driven assessment of performance, rather than subjective assessment. So that's exactly what I just said. So in this session, we will cover the types of metrics we can track and you can use to demonstrate the value of technology, right? So that's the context of this session. There are a few challenges, as much as we may talk about metrics. Let's understand first of all, what are the challenges in using metrics, and make sure we resolve those challenges to leverage the most from the metrics that we measure and put forward. So the first point I'd like to make is that metrics are useful only as a comparison against a benchmark, right? Let's take any number. If you say, 99.999% uptime, that's a very common industry standard benchmark. But is it easy to achieve that? Not. Does it cost a lot of money to achieve that? Yes, it does. So therefore, you have to understand what are you using as a benchmark to compare your own performance to, right? It could be organization and function specific, right? You may be in an industry where the 99.99% uptime is not worth the money that you need to invest in, just as an example, right? Or the second benchmark would be industry or market specific. If let's say you're in an online e-commerce business, or you have a trading solution, right, that trades in stock, or you have an online banking solution. Now, there, the industry benchmarks are pretty clear and standard. For a trading system, you must have a extremely micro response time. There cannot be delays in processing. So there you cannot try to adapt to your own organizational benchmarks. There are some industry standards. If customers don't get that sort of a metric in performance, they will quickly switch to competition. So the point I'm trying to make is that when you decide metrics, don't try to set lofty goals that are unreasonable for your own business. Try to follow what is relevant to you. Okay, it's not everybody need not have the same metric for any particular performance, right? The second point is you need to have the right tools. Now, gathering data, application performance, infrastructure performance, overall IT performance, it actually needs a lot of effort to gather the data in the first place. If you don't have good data, if you don't have comprehensive data, then the insights that you get from it are going to be very limited. And frankly, it's going to be no use for all the effort that you take and all the investments that you make in trying to get that going, right? And the third point, which is a challenge in metrics, is metrics often depend on other organizational units. What that means is that, it may be an IT metric, but several other functions. For example, if it's a customer-facing metric, all of the operations teams, the actual customer service teams, all of them are contributors to achieving customer satisfaction, not just how the IT system works. So when you define metrics, there may be some metrics that are exclusive to IT, but there may be other metrics that are to be jointly with other organizational units or functions. And then also in terms of meeting those expectations, all of you have to work together. So it's important to understand what is a pure IT metric and what is an IT metric that works with the other functions. Okay. So these are the few challenges that we have when getting into a metrics program. All right. So ideally, what you need to do is to create what we call a framework for metrics, or just define the metrics that you need. And the way I look at it, I categorize metrics into four, right? The first is operational metrics, the second is financial, third is business, and fourth is strategic. And I'll explain each one, and then we'll see examples of what kind of metrics go into each of these categories and why they're relevant, right? Operational metrics are fundamental to the IT team itself, right? So these are metrics that can be used to optimize your own performance and reduce any negative impact that you may have on business due to IT itself. So that's more for internal consumption and internal improvement of processes. Financial metrics are metrics that are obviously cost related. So they're first used to determine your IT budget, and then actually they can be used to identify the value that IT adds to, and I contend that IT can add value to both the top and bottom lines for a business. Okay. So, and then we'll talk more about that as we get into the actual metrics, but that's the financial metrics. Business metrics, what I classify as business metrics are metrics that where you add value to business from a customer or partner satisfaction perspective. All right. So that sort of doesn't necessarily mean a revenue impact, but it actually means significant customer satisfaction. Customers will come back to you and so on. So it's an indirect impact to the financials, right? And the last, and interestingly today it's becoming one of the more important ones, is strategic metrics, right? Now these are metrics, and I'll show you how interesting they can be, that can be used to demonstrate the strategic value of IT from a future growth perspective. Now, traditionally, IT is, as we discussed in the first slide itself, it's very important to any business. Everyone knows that. Nobody denies the importance of IT. But quite often, and honestly, IT is considered to be, everyone always says technology is an enabler. So what that tends to mean is that technology cannot be a driver of business. And we need to change that mindset. Technology can do great things. And if you run your IT function strategically, then IT can actually be the driver of various business initiatives and not just an enabler of initiatives that someone else drives. Okay. And we'll see some of the investments you have to make and some of how you can measure and demonstrate the performance from a strategic perspective. Okay. So I'm not going to go deep into discussing specific metrics. That's the quite self-explanatory. And besides, this is a very, very sample representative list. If you dig deeper, the number of actual metrics that one can gather it's a very, very long list. So I'm just going to give you a sample, but just explain the reasoning behind why they add value, right? The more important aspect is the reasoning behind why they add value. All right. So the first one is operational metrics. One is obviously application development and maintenance, right? So these are quite standard metrics that are captured: number of projects, how many are completed on time, which projects are getting delayed and by how much, and so on, right? So that most organizations do that. But what you need to do is understand why you're capturing these metrics. So for example, one very important thing is to identify the root cause of the delays. So if you look at the third one there, or the fourth one, percentage of projects delayed due to. Now, I think it's very important to capture that and, definitively identify why projects are getting delayed, because only if you do that, then you will be able to address the cause and find a solution, right? So whether is it lack of clarity in functional requirements, which is one of the classic things that IT always debates, but it could simply be lack of enough people. It could be lack of skills in people, right? It could be lack of infrastructure, and there could be some other non-specific reasons, which is to put it nicely, people just not doing the job properly. So it's important to understand where things are going wrong, and then the corrective action can be taken accordingly. If you just track X number of projects got delayed by 20%, and without going into the root cause, then you're not really sure what you're going to do to fix it. And if you look at the list of reasons, the fix is also very different. Lack of skills implies you need to get training. Lack of people or lack of infrastructure means you need to invest. So you need to talk to the L&D department, you need to talk to the finance department and convince them for the need for these investments, right? So it's very important to know, first of all, why things are going the way they're going, right? If you look at the last one, it is talking about human resource productivity. And then I further categorize that into internal and outsourced. Now, productivity is not very easy to measure. It's possible, but difficult. But at the same time, productivity is also one of the biggest contributors to failure in all other metrics or not meeting all other metrics. Project delays, project errors, mean response times, everything is due to productivity, right? So it's very important to measure that, find a way to measure it for your own people. Also separate between internal and outsourced, see which one is working better, or a hybrid model may be working better, all right? So these are operational metrics from an application development. Similarly, you have to do the same thing for infrastructure. Now, infrastructure, actually, interestingly, infrastructure issues have the highest impact, but they're also easiest to measure, right? Because there are many sophisticated tools, knowing that infra is so critical. So you need to track, how much of planned downtime, how much of unplanned downtime. Why do we need so much planned downtime? Although it's planned and you can schedule it outside business hours and so on and so forth, but why is that even required? Unplanned downtime is clearly not acceptable to anyone. But then why is it happening? Is there component failure? Is there configuration failure? Is there overutilization? As in your CPU is getting maxed out, your memory is getting maxed out. These things can actually be pretty immediately rectified, right? Once you know the root cause, then it's only a matter of investing in the right place to resolve these issues. So if you get the trend of what I'm saying, you can see how these specific metrics are so important to determining what is going wrong and therefore what you need to do, right? So they're not just metrics for presentation, they're actually metrics for insights and action, right? So like the last point there, and I already said it once, is often they are indicators of underinvestment and need to be resolved by better budget allocations, and sometimes it's a good sign. Maybe you thought you only need X volume and you're actually getting 1.5X the volume, which is a good problem to have, right? But correspondingly, you also need to upgrade your hardware systems. So we need to invest in that to compensate for the growth in business or to support the growth in business. So that's the operational metrics from an infrastructure perspective. And the last one I have is information security metrics. Now, generally, there is a tendency to say that security incidents are part of the compliance and risk teams and they will manage that. And which is true in many cases, they're supposed to do that because they're the experts. But the root cause of many InfoSec incidents are with the application and infra teams. Either the application has not been developed to meet all of the security standards it required, or the infrastructure has not been hardened enough, the configurations may not be correct. So although the InfoSec incidents may be tracked by someone else, it's important for IT to be well aware of that. All right. And the last one, which is very similar to the infrastructure, is related to applications. So again, the same thing, application downtime, planned or unplanned. Now, application performance, as I've said there, is actually the first measure or the most direct measure of customer satisfaction. So therefore, it's important to track infrastructure failures result in performance issues, but they're not directly understood by the end business, whereas issues with the application are immediately identified by the end user. So it's very important to track these kind of performances. Now, the root cause is quite often skill limitations, and that's why it's important to know where things are going wrong, right? I tend to contend that developing a robust and scalable application for production, as we say, it requires a slightly different level of skill than just writing basic working code. So just saying that, oh, well, I wrote this application, it has no bugs, the testing team has certified it, that's great, but that doesn't mean that it will actually scale and perform in production. All right, so you need to understand those gaps, and you may have no bugs in the system, but you may still have a lot of other issues in production. It could be related to response times, it could be related to volumes, how long it takes, and so on and so forth. All right, so that's the fourth category of operational metrics. Now let's move on to financial metrics. Now, financial metrics are actually very, very straightforward. There's nothing too complicated about it. Broadly, and I know there's a lot of variation in how businesses define OPEX and CAPEX, so I won't worry too much about that. But the point I wanted to make is the first thing is the cost of human resources. All right. Now, three things happen there. First of all, human resources is usually the highest in IT compared to other business functions, usually in most organizations, right? So therefore, it is pretty important to understand what value that pool of resources is contributing to the organization as a whole, right? What happens, this is a very common problem. When you outsource IT work, right, you outsource it to a consultant, you pay a fee, you pay a per day, per hour, per week, per month fee. And that's very easily measurable. I get a consultant for X number of months. This is the monthly rate, and therefore this is my outflow for this particular set of consultants. Now, the same thing with the employees, the cost is actually not measured so well. Why? Because, employee salary is assumed to be fixed. Put it a little bluntly, whether or not the employee does any work, the salary is spent anyway, right? So no one really tracks that how much effort was required by an employee on this particular project and what is the apportioned cost, which is then the cost of the project, right? I mean, I won't say no one tracks, but it's quite often overlooked. So it's very important to understand how much you're paying, even in terms of employee cost for every project, not as a whole for the IT function, right? The other problem that happens is employee time is considered fungible across projects. It's like you've got an expert in a certain area, you're working on a project, another project gets into an issue, you promptly pull that person out, get them to work on the other project. So from a delivery perspective, from just being proactive and practical, that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that approach. But from a financial metric perspective, it's important to track who spent time on what. All right. Otherwise, there could be one project that is really sucking up resources, whereas the cost for that is apportioned to some other project, which becomes a little unfair. You don't realize that this project is not worth spending so much on because it's not giving you the value. So that's why these kind of metrics are important. The second set of financial metrics obviously is simply moving on to infrastructure, right? Now, again, very simple. I'm not stating something that's rocket science here, but you need to measure it at a pretty granular level. It's not just a high bucket of infrastructure cost, but I would measure cost of infrastructure as required for production environments, as required for all of my non-prod environments, my UAT, my development, my staging. How much are we spending in each of these categories, right? The same thing for the hosting, the same thing for the licenses that we spend on, whether it's development or production. And that's very important because if you think about it, the costs that you incur in production, which is a direct impact to the way business is run, I wouldn't mind a little overspend there to give customer satisfaction, to keep the business running smoothly. But you've got to be careful not to spend too much on the non-prod side of things, right? Because that can actually be controlled a lot better. And very, very interestingly, as much as everyone is advocating the value of the cloud and everyone's moving to the cloud these days, the cost overrun problem is actually significantly worsened when you move to the cloud, right? So I think I talked about this in my previous session, or in some other session, but one of the sort of problems with the cloud is that it is very easy to deploy new infrastructure. In a traditional business, I have to run through a lot of processes to actually procure one tiny piece of hardware. On the cloud, I can click a button if I have the rights and commission a server. So the costs can really, really go out of hand, and you have to be able to measure all of that and be able to justify why do you need so many development servers, right? Why do you need so many staging servers? Is it really required? So, those kind of metrics, and often in this particular scenario, and again, some of the things I may be generalizing, but they are still broadly true. The IT team will only look at the IT requirements and generally disregard the cost. whereas the finance team has a very strong focus on the cost and always needs justification. So in my opinion, these are very good complementary teams. So when you are reviewing financial metrics, right, even whether it's application development, human resources, or infra, I think it would be wonderful if it can be done as a cross-functional team of IT and finance, right? Because they both bring a very different perspective. And when IT is forced to justify to finance, or vice versa, that IT can just explain to finance why they need to spend more, then that would actually result in a very optimal solution, right? So that's why these metrics are important. Going back to my previous point, sometimes other functions, other organized units need to be involved. And this is one such example. All right. So these are now, we talked about financial metrics. Now, the third category is actually business metrics, right? These are relatively, at least the representative list I have is pretty small, but conceptually, what I consider business metrics are essentially to do with ease of use of your own applications in your solutions, right? Now, I actually bucket them into three categories. One is direct users of your applications, and they may be internal or they may be external. So direct users, as in, let's say you have an online banking solution, you're a bank, and all your customers are direct users of your applications, right? So how happy are they with how your applications are running from an uptime perspective, from a performance perspective, etc., etc. The second category is ability to integrate with partner systems. Now, a lot of businesses today, especially all of us getting into the SOA and web services approaches, a lot of businesses need to integrate with each other. Or as a bank, you consume a lot of services, let's say for PAN and Aadhaar verification from NSDL as an example, right? So how easy are your systems working when they need to integrate with partner systems, right? And the third category, which is actually also a little bit of a strategic metric, which we haven't talked about yet, is ability to participate in industry-driven integration initiatives. Again, going back to banking, the entire open banking initiative, are your systems capable of participating in such initiatives? Have you taken the right efforts and invested in the right projects to actually make that happen, right? So these are the kind of metrics that I classify as business metrics, where you need to understand whether the systems that you are deploying, are they keeping your customers happy, right? Now, interestingly, this is not a very, very singularly an IT metric, because it may be affected by how the partner integration teams work. They may be affected how the front end teams sell to the customers and so on. So the problem may not necessarily be with IT, but still the metric will tell you that is it an IT problem, or it's simply a customer education problem, or a partner integration issue, and more on their side than on your side, and so on. But it's important to know all this, so when there is a discussion, you can bring the right data to the table. All right. So that's what we categorize as business metrics. And the last one in the bucket, which is last one, but it's pretty important, is strategic metrics, right? Now, what I consider IT is now significantly moving up the ladder in terms of value they add to business, right? So, and these are metrics that have not traditionally been the point of focus, but I think we need to start focusing a lot more on this, right? For example, I always push for IT to try and measure a direct contribution to business P&L, right? We cannot say that, well, my systems are running fine, so I assume business is doing okay. No. What if we are able to say that we deployed this small feature, or we deployed this big solution, and because of that, we started to get more customers, right? If you can build a correlation between the IT features that you build and the customers that you brought in, or the number of transactions that you increased, I tend to treat that as a direct contribution, right? So that adds the value that we are contributing. On the other hand, on the flip side of the story, there could be lost revenue. If your systems are down, there is and this happens, I think, more often, or this is measured and noticed more often. But directly, systems are down, you lose money. So that's the direct reflection on IT. So that needs to be tracked as well, right? Then moving on to something a little more than just revenue is how's your adoption of emerging technology, right? How do you measure that? I mean, some ways to do it is, how many projects do you actually have that are trying out emerging technology? And emerging technology is everything that I explained in my first session, right? So many innovative things can be done. So how many such projects are in progress, whether at the proof of concept stage, or if you have anything that's already in production, that's wonderful. How many such projects are there? What's your percentage of IT budget that you allocate to this, right? How many of your team are allocated? If I mean, it's a very simple explanation, right? If I have a very small fraction, 1%, 2%, 5% allocated, then 95% are just doing day-to-day operations. And clearly, you are not going to really scale up on the strategic front very, very quickly. So what percentage of people are actually allowed to focus on these kind of projects, right? The number of projects where IT is playing a leadership role. Now, obviously, if it's a purely IT project, like a full hardware infrastructure revamp, obviously IT leads and IT follows and everything is IT. But from a business perspective, and again, this is closely tied into emerging technology. Let's say you are introducing a solution for retail, remote surveillance of retail stores, right? Now, IT understands the technology of remote surveillance. IT understands how it can be actually used, what use cases can be leveraged. So IT can actually take the lead in deploying and building such projects. They need not always come from the business team or from the customer service team. So how many projects is IT really contributing in that manner, right? Then the next one is budget allocated to training and development, especially on new technologies. Are we spending enough? Right? Are we spending enough in getting our people trained? Because if you're not doing that now, then you're never going to get into the previous metrics where you actually lead projects or you actually do products and projects with emerging technologies if you don't train your people, right? And the next one is very similar, percentage of CIO time spent on strategic innovation. But more than that, the last one is very important. I always believe that what you do for your day-to-day operations for your organization is one thing. That's really good. You're keeping the organization going and running and succeeding. But the real measure of value in general is if you can contribute something either to the industry as a whole or as a learning for academics. And in today's world, the startup ecosystem is just too big to ignore. The startup ecosystem is also inherently, just by its very nature, a little more innovative than larger businesses. So how much are you engaging with them, right? Because that's a great way to pull in innovation, pull in learning, and give back to the industry as well. So all these kind of metrics, I think I bucket them as strategic metrics because they really push IT up the value chain, right? IT is no more just a support function. IT is a driving function for any business, all right? So that's what I bucket as strategic metrics. So those were the representative list of metrics in the way I bucketed them. Of course, that's just a sample framework. You are free to, create metrics of your own. You are free to bucket them as you wish. But I think that was just to explain a concept and how it can be done. All right. So let's talk a little bit about how to go about it. Design, planning, and execution for a metrics program. Everyone's already capturing metrics in some form or manner, so you can just revisit this and make sure it's aligned or make the right mid-course corrections. So first is define the objectives. Why are we really capturing these metrics, right? And as I said somewhere earlier in this conversation, it's never a great idea to capture metrics only for presentations, right? Please capture metrics to actually leverage them, learn how to improve IT efficiency. They could be external related metrics. You should be able to for example, you should be able to demonstrate regulatory compliance. Regulators come to most businesses, you should be able to quickly demonstrate. Or objective determination of customer satisfaction or partner satisfaction. You will quite often get feedback from customers, which is largely subjective, saying, I don't think your application works well enough. You should be able to demonstrate that, hey, really in this period of time, I didn't really have much downtime, or I didn't really have any instances of slow performance. So that feedback can then be, considered in the right perspective. All right. So that's the objective. So you need to understand why you're capturing metrics. engage both IT and non-IT stakeholders when deciding metrics. So, I see cases where everyone tries to do this industry standard 99.59 uptime. And then you say, yeah, but I cannot invest much money in infrastructure. So that's somewhat unfair, right? I mean, if you don't allow for investment, but yet expect, the uptime that Google provides with billions of dollars spent. So I think that balance needs to be found. The third point, which I already talked about, I think, is start with baseline data, because without benchmark, I feel you can never demonstrate improvement, right? I mean, if you know you were at X and then you are now X plus something, you can actually show, or if you're at X minus, you realize you went wrong. But if there was no X to start with, either within the organization or within the industry, then you don't really know where you stand from, let's say, the previous year. Okay. Select fewer and less complex metrics, especially if you are just beginning your metrics program. It's just not worth the number of things you can capture is too many, but you cannot really action on so many things. So just start simple and make sure they are helping you take the right actions, and present the metrics along with insights in an easy to understand manner, right? I mean, it sounds like a very straightforward and obvious statement, but quite often, you tend to present data that is very technical. Just saying server uptime and server downtime doesn't mean anything to me, but you need to tell me that, yeah, server downtime meant that we lost business, for example, right? Or it did. So you need to explain what that metric means. Okay. I quite track often, and I would like to share is the first one is what is referred to as watermelon metrics. All right. So watermelon metrics, as it's explained there, the internal metrics seem to show that everything is working just fine. So everything is all green and everyone's very happy in all the internal presentations. But at the same time, there are too many customer complaints. So that sort of somehow doesn't seem to make sense, right? So then you need to look at both in tandem. Either side could be wrong. If your internal metrics are actually accurate and things are going well, then maybe the customer complaints are misunderstood or misrepresented. It's possible, it's not impossible, but they could be real and you may have problems that you missed in your internal systems, right? So always correlate both the findings and see where you really stand. It shouldn't be a pretense that internally we are all fine while customers are very unhappy. That could be the worst situation, right? And the second one, which is also very important, and actually, especially in larger projects, and I talk a lot about digital transformation. I assist a lot of businesses on digital transformation. More than watermelon metrics, this is more important under those situations. See, when you undertake a really massive project, you always have what I have been always happily referring to as the hockey stick effect, right? There is a period of time when you're spending money on building the new systems or the transformation. There is a period of time when you are getting everyone used to the new systems. There is a period of time when you may be running old and new in parallel, correlating, finding gaps, solving them, and so on. So it's quite possible that there is that same period of time when things are actually worse than they were before, right? So I think it's very important to make everybody understand that from some perspective, either it could be the cost perspective or the customer satisfaction perspective, it's quite possible that you may see a slight worsening of metrics and feedback and all that until things stabilize. And then the promise is, and that's the whole point of the hockey stick that you see there. The promise is that in the future, once you are out of that dip, the benefits will be rather exponential. So that's the promise. So you've got to expect that, just bear with that small dip. But set that expectation up front. Otherwise, everyone thinks that, the day I deploy the new system, everything will be hunky-dory and we'll all be on an exponential rise. All right. So two effects to look out for, and this will also be demonstrated by the metrics that you have been measuring so far, right? So with that, the last slide, which is the key takeaways, a summary of everything I spoke so far. So metrics are important for an objective data-driven assessment of performance, all right? So that's very important. There's too much subjective assessment saying things are not working, but nobody is able to really say what is not working. That doesn't work for anyone, right? The good news is there are several sophisticated tools that capture this data. They provide insights, analyze, present it. So there's no shortage of solutions there. You just need to pick the right one for your business, right? What to look out for is incorrect data, incorrect interpretation, and worst, and it happens, is misrepresentation. All right. It basically, you just think you're doing well when you're really not. So that's not good for anybody, right? Keep your metrics framework simple, only to the extent that you can actually understand and leverage, right? Again, I repeat my comments many times, but do not do it just for visual appeal. Yeah, we see plenty of metric slides out there, which have fancy graphs and fancy pie charts and so on. The greens and the reds and all sorts of colors. But all that is not, there's no real value to that. As long as you can read the insights and take the action, then it's useful. Otherwise, it's not. All right. And the last point is strategic metrics are the most difficult to measure, understand, explain, and justify. But in my opinion, they're important to push the IT function a little ahead of the curve. So we must get that as well alongside operational metrics. All right. So in the third session, we'll actually talk about how the technology teams and IT operations can now start to realign to this whole new way of doing business. All right.
So thank you so much, Vikas, for this wonderful session, and look forward to connecting with you again for the third session.
Most welcome, Neeta. Happy to be able to contribute. Yeah, look forward to seeing you all soon.
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for participating. Have a great evening ahead. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.